How Secrets Survived Brutal Winters. Hey guys, good evening, or maybe good morning, depending on when you've decided to hit play on this little historical lullaby. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. Don't worry, we're still floating through the dusty, often confusing attic of European history, but this time we're not tracking a king or queen or even a particularly tragic prince. We're going to look at the other kind of historical artifact, the secret, the whisper, the thing that someone, somewhere, desperately wanted to keep buried under a few feet of snow, or maybe just a lot of inconvenient paperwork. So, go ahead and dim those lights, get settled in, find that perfect pillow dent. Let the sound of my perfectly adequate, not at all dramatic voice just kind of wash over you. If you drift off, no sweat. That's kind of the point. We're in no rush. We're going to be here for a while, calmly dissecting the historical equivalent of a note passed in class that somehow ended up in a royal archive. Tonight, we begin with a chilling little story from the far, far north, the kind of place where winter doesn't just happen, it arrives, slams the door, and stays for 9 to 10 months just to be annoying. We're talking about Muscovy, way back in the mid-17th century, a time and a place that was basically a masterclass in how to be miserable but make it fashionable. The Silent Prince and the Unspoken Truth. We're settling in on the life of a man who, if he'd been born 300 years later, probably would have just been really good at complicated board games. But no, he was born into the Romanov dynasty, which meant his entire existence was either going to be brutal, confusing, and short, or long, slightly boring, but still brutal. His name was Tsar Alexei the First. Now, Alexei himself wasn't the secret. He was just the guy sitting atop the enormous shivering structure that held the secrets. He was, by all accounts, a reasonably decent fella for a Tsar, devout, a fan of falconry, and generally avoided setting fire to entire cities, which, for a 17th century Russian ruler, is basically employee of the month. But Alexei had a very, very big problem that wasn't about a war, or a plague, or even a sudden urge to execute a few hundred boyars. It was about a previous Tsar. Let's drift back just a tiny bit, shall we? Before Alexei, there was his dad, Mikhail the First. Mikhail was the first Romanov, essentially the guy who had to clean up the mess left by the time of troubles, which is the historical term for a period when literally everything went wrong all the time. Mikhail was chosen because he was young, impressionable, and his family wasn't currently locked in a dungeon waiting for an axe. And, crucially, the powerful noble families thought they could easily manipulate him. Of course, he was the first Romanov, so you know how that plan went. Mikhail ruled for a good long time, from 1613 to 1445. He stabilized things, more or less, and had a bunch of kids. The problem child, and the one that the entire Romanov PR machine would spend the next 300 years trying to quietly shovel into the historical snowdrift, was Ivan. Not Ivan the Terrible, obviously. This was just a regular Ivan. Ivan Mikhailovich was Mikhail's oldest son, and therefore the heir to the throne. This is where the historical whispering campaign really begins to kick into high gear. Ivan, born in 1633, was, let's just say, a historical footnote that refused to be neat. He didn't make it to adulthood. He died at the age of 9, a genuinely sad, sickly little kid who barely got to see his 10th birthday before succumbing to some disease or other. But here is the kernel of the historical secret that Alexei I inherited, and the one that had to survive the brutal Russian winters. Was Ivan the true heir? And perhaps more darkly, did he even exist in the way they claimed?
See, succession in Muscovy was, like everything else, brutal. The Tsar's power was absolute, but the moment he died, the wolves came out. If the heir was a sickly 9-year-old boy, then the wolves would be sharpening their teeth very, very close to the crib. It was common knowledge, though never spoken above a comfortable murmur in the court, that Tsarevich Ivan was non compos mentis. That's the nice Latin term for not all there. He was considered intellectually and developmentally disabled. The records are thin, deliberately so, but they suggest that Ivan was fragile, unable to speak clearly, and quite possibly suffered from severe cognitive impairment. Now, imagine you're Tsar Mikhail. You have fought tooth and nail to keep your new dynasty from sliding back into the chaos of the time of troubles. You have an heir who, frankly, would be a disaster for the stability of the realm. The boy is 9. He is universally regarded as a sweet but profoundly incapable child. What do? Well, you do what any desperate 17th century monarch does. You double down on the secrecy. The official narrative, the one that got written down in the gold-leafed, heavily censored court chronicles, was that Tsarevich Ivan was merely sickly, a tragic little soul whose passing was a great loss to the nation. The truth, however, had to be carefully managed. The Romanovs couldn't risk the appearance of a contested succession, especially not over an heir who was too weak to even argue his own case. So the court enacted a policy of quiet, deliberate, and cold weather-appropriate erasure. Every letter, every document, every mention of the Tsarevich's health or development was either destroyed or rewritten by scribes who were very, very good at their jobs and very, very aware of the unpleasant alternatives to compliance. It was a secret kept not by a sudden dramatic assassination, but by the slow, bureaucratic freezing out of inconvenient facts, like leaving a pile of papers out in the driving snow until they simply crumbled to dust.
And Alexei, when he took the throne, knew this story. He had seen his brother's quiet, almost invisible life, and his even quieter, more invisible death. This wasn't a scandal he started. It was a structural weakness in the Romanov foundation that he had to manage. He had to perpetuate the myth of the sickly but brilliant boy prince who was just so tragically taken too soon. Because if the truth got out, that the first Romanov had secured the succession by essentially sidelining his true but disabled heir, it would have been an open invitation for every ambitious boyar family to question the legitimacy of the entire line. It would have meant, essentially, going back to the time of troubles, and nobody wanted that. Nobody at all. This is the kind of secret that survived the brutal winter, the secret of omission. It wasn't about what they did, it was about what they refused to say, what they refused to write down, and what they made damn sure the official history would simply glide over. It's a quiet tragedy of a little boy whose life was deemed too dangerous to acknowledge honestly. A shame, really, for a history that could have been a little more humane. Let's float over to another royal disaster. And speaking of royal disasters, let's leave the Chell of Muscovy and drift just a little to the west, towards the glittering, complicated, and utterly doomed world of the Habsburgs. Ah, the Habsburgs. If there was ever a dynasty that managed to turn dynastic purity into a genetic car crash, it was them. They were like a historical warning label. Warning, may cause chin protrusion and general fragility. We're going to focus on the Spanish branch in the late 17th century, specifically the last of the line, Charles II of Spain. If Tsar Alexei had a secret of omission, Charles II was the secret, entirely created by excessive inclusion of the same family tree over and over again. His life is a genuinely tragic story, But in the context of our sleepy history dive, it's also quite a comical, snarky study in what happens when you don't date outside your cousin group. Charles II was born in 1661. His father was Philip IV, who was already an old man when Charles was born. Philip IV was a very busy man, genetically speaking. Charles's family tree was less a tree and more a very tightly coiled, thorny vine. Check this out and try to keep your eyes open. His father, Philip IV, was the uncle of his mother, Mariana of Austria. Yeah, uncle and niece. Keep it in the family, right? His paternal grandfather and maternal grandfather were brother and sister. His paternal grandfather and maternal grandmother were cousins. In fact, Charles II's entire pedigree was so restricted that he had only 4 unique great-grandparents, when a normal human being, thankfully, has 8. He had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, which is roughly the same level you'd get from a child whose parents were siblings, because why not double down? The result of this genetic dedication to the Habsburg ideal was a monarch who was, to put it mildly, fragile. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because, of course he was. When a royal is so physically and mentally compromised, the court simply cannot admit that perhaps, just perhaps, it's the result of 5 generations of first-cousin marriages. No, that's too mundane, too embarrassing. It must be witches. It must be a spell. The secret that survived the brutal sun-drenched winters of Spain was the denial of biological reality. Charles didn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was 5. When he finally did speak, his tongue was reportedly so large that he had severe speech impediments, making his pronouncements generally garbled and hard to understand. He was short, often ill, subject to convulsions, and had a famous, truly enormous Habsburg jaw. The Habsburg jaw was so severe that he found it difficult to chew and often drooled. He was called the Handsome by some of his more sycophantic courtiers, a classic ironic contrast, given he looked, as one historian gently put it, like a half-baked Habsburg potato. His entire life was a quiet, sad ordeal. He was a king who was, from birth, barely functioning. He was surrounded by competing factions of courtiers, priests, and ambitious relatives who were all quietly trying to position themselves for the moment he would inevitably and mercifully die. The secret wasn't a dark, hidden deed, but the loud, obvious fact of his genetic fate, which everyone pretended was a sign of great piety, or conversely, a demonic curse. This sad, sickly, and spoiled child of incest ruled for 35 years. A whole lot of history happened while Charles II was quietly deteriorating. Wars were fought, treaties were signed, and empires were managed, badly, by his mother and various regents, all while the king himself was shuffling down the hallway, barely able to lift his feet. The secret's survival was ensured by the sheer inertia of the system. Nobody could afford to admit the truth, that the glorious Spanish Habsburg line was collapsing because of their own obsession with keeping the blood pure. To admit that would be to admit a failure of God-given divine right. So instead, they blamed demons, they tried exorcisms, and they wrote down endless flowery accounts of the king's valor and piety. The actual contents of the secret, the genetic makeup, was so obvious that people whispered about it in the streets, but officially, within the walls of the palace, it was utterly unspeakable. The only acceptable narrative was the one that placed blame on the supernatural, because a historical truth that reflected badly on the entire dynasty was simply not allowed to survive. It was frozen out of the official record, preserved only in the dry humor of historical hindsight.
and when he finally died without an heir in 1700, his passing didn't just end a life, it ended the Spanish Habsburg line and kicked off the massive continent-spanning conflict known as the War of the Spanish Succession. One frail, sickly little king, the last whisper of an inbred family tree, ended up dragging all of Europe into a bloody, expensive, and ultimately avoidable war, because his parents, great-grandparents, and everyone else thought marrying a cousin was just a great, sensible idea. The Boy King and the Paper Trail. Let's now gently turn our attention towards a much earlier time, where secrets didn't have to survive a brutal winter, but a brutal parliamentary brawl. We're talking about England in the 15th century, during the time of the Wars of the Roses. Now, this era is not known for its calm, its decorum, or its tendency to keep secrets nicely wrapped. It's known for a lot of unpleasant beheadings and general confusion. We'll focus on the poor, doomed life of Edward V, one of the famous princes in the Tower. This is a story that has been picked apart, debated, and frankly used in so many historical dramas that it's hard to find a sleepy angle. But we can. We're not interested in the who of the murder. We're interested in the secret that the political machine of the time had to create to justify the murder. Edward V was the son of Edward VIII, a very tall, very charismatic, and famously womanizing king of England. When Edward VIII suddenly died in April 1883, the heir, Edward V, was a young boy of 12. His younger brother, Richard, the Duke of York, was 9. Now, a boy king is never a good thing in a dangerous, unstable monarchy. It's an open invitation for the regent, the person ruling for the child, to just, well, take the crown for themselves. And that's exactly what Edward VIII's younger brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, did. Let's pause right there.
But Richard couldn't just walk up to his 12-year-old nephew, take his crown, and shove him in the Tower of London. Well, he did shove him in the Tower of London, but he needed a secret, a perfectly crafted, legally sound, and suitably scandalous reason to justify the monumental act of usurpation. This is where we get the secret of illegitimacy. The secret that Richard III and his allies engineered was that Edward IV's marriage to Edward V's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was invalid, a non-starter, and therefore all of their children, including the boy king Edward V, were illegitimate and had no right to the throne. It's a classic move. I didn't take the crown. You never had it in the first place. The basis for this scandalous secret was a rather dry premarital contract. Edward IV, being a charismatic playboy, had reportedly engaged himself in a pre-contract of marriage with another woman, Eleanor Butler, before he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. In the eyes of the 15th century church, a binding pre-contract was as good as a full marriage. If Edward IV was already secretly betrothed, his later marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was technically null and void, making his children, all of them, bastards. So Richard and his supporters went to town. They presented a petition to Parliament, which of course they controlled, called the Titulus Regius, the title of the king. This was the historical document, the legal secret that survived the turbulent political winters of 1483. It laid out in great, snarky, and legally convoluted detail why Edward V was not the rightful king. It claimed that Edward IV's marriage was made by the Queen, his wife, and others of her affinity by sorcery and witchcraft, and, more legally damagingly, cited the pre-contract with Eleanor Butler, which was supposedly attested to by a very important bishop. The Titulus Regius essentially created a historical secret out of thin air, or at least out of a dusty old piece of parchment. It was a secret designed not to be hidden, but to be proclaimed loudly in public in order to change the political reality. The truth of the matter, whether the pre-contract was legally binding or even real, or whether the bishop was simply paid off, was irrelevant. What mattered was that a piece of paper, a historical secret, was used to justify a change in the royal line.
The Whispered Secrets of the Winter Palace. Great! Let's keep that gentle momentum going and float now into the dark, weird, and perpetually chilly world of the early Romanov dynasty. We're moving forward a little in time and shifting our focus slightly west, but staying firmly in the realm of Russian paranoia, which, as we know, is always fertile ground for extremely long, sleep-inducing historical monologues. We're settling into the time just after the chaotic Time of Troubles, when the Romanovs, a perfectly respectable but otherwise unremarkable boyar family, suddenly found themselves in charge of the entire, vast, frozen Muscovite state. Their claim to the throne was, shall we say, a little bit shaky, and when a dynasty feels shaky, it becomes absolutely obsessed with secrecy and surveillance. They need to know everything, and they need to make sure that everyone else knows nothing. The biggest secret in the early Romanov court wasn't who was sleeping with whom, though there was plenty of that, of course, but the constant, grinding fear that someone else had a better claim to the throne. The shadows of the deposed dynasty, the Rurikids, and the ghosts of the false Dimitris were everywhere. Every strange death, every sudden illness, every slightly too loud disagreement in the court was seen through the lens of a potential coup. This required a special kind of information management, and this is where we meet the Preobrazhensky Prikaz, or the secret chancery. This was Peter the Great's personal, terrifyingly efficient secret police. Now, when we think of secret police, we usually think of dramatic raids and arrests. But the real sleep-inducing labor of the Preobrazhensky Prikaz was much quieter and more subtle, the cultivation of informers. Think of the poor servants in the Tsar's court. They were the people who saw everything. Who went into whose room late at night? Who drank too much vodka and said something treasonous about the size of the Tsar's hat? And who was subtly pushing for a particular person to get a government post? They were everywhere, and they were the lifeblood of the secret chancery. The secret that survived the brutal St. Petersburg winter was often a single, carefully chosen phrase, a muttered complaint about the Tsar's foreign policy, perhaps, reported by a low-level laundress to a low-level clerk in the Prikaz. It was a secret preserved by fear and poverty. The informers weren't usually ideological crusaders. They were people who needed a small payoff or just wanted to make sure they weren't the next ones being dragged in for questioning. The interrogation process, again, was less about dramatic torture and more about linguistic attrition. They wanted the story told exactly the same way, over and over again until the narrator was exhausted and confused. If you change a detail, if you say the boyar complained on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday, that inconsistency is immediately seized upon as evidence of a deeper conspiracy. They weren't hunting for truth, they were hunting for narrative consistency, because in a world of absolute monarchy, narrative consistency was the only thing that mattered. This brings us to one of the greatest Romanov secrets that survived, the uncomfortable truth about the early life of Peter the Great. Peter was a force of nature, obsessed with bringing Russia into the modern age, but his early years were messy. He was effectively locked out of power by his older half-sister, Sophia, who was the regent. Sophia was an immensely clever and ambitious woman. Of course she was. And the secret she wanted to preserve was the legitimacy of her own power. The secret Peter held and eventually weaponized was that Sophia was illegally using the regency to establish her own dynasty. The entire court knew this, but it was another one of those secrets preserved by silence until Peter grew up, got enough support, and suddenly everyone was allowed to remember the secret they had all been pretending to forget for years. The most fascinating part of this story is how the secret of Peter's legitimacy was preserved in physical isolation. Peter was basically exiled from Moscow to the isolated estate of Preobrazhenskaya. This was supposed to keep him harmless and distracted, but while he was there, he wasn't idling. He was playing war games with his own play regiments, the future crack units of the Russian Imperial Guard. The secret was that while everyone in Moscow was gossiping and plotting in candlelight, the future Tsar was quietly building a private, loyal military force just outside the city walls. This secret survived because everyone dismissed it as a childlike hobby. Oh, little Peter is playing soldiers again. Isn't that adorable? They assumed the secret of power lay in words and bureaucracy. Peter knew the secret lay in who had the most disciplined muskets. This is an ironic contrast we love, the fate of an empire decided by a game of make-believe. Let's gently glide away from the cold of Russia and over to the slightly damp but equally secretive court of the Tudor dynasty in England. Specifically, let's look at Elizabeth I and the secret that kept her on the throne, the secret of marriage and succession. Elizabeth I was famous for being the Virgin Queen, but this title masked a deep, constant 45-year-long negotiation with her own legitimacy and mortality. The secret she wanted to preserve was the ambiguity of her intentions. She constantly flirted with marriage, to French princes, to Spanish Habsburgs, to various English nobles, but she never committed. Why was this ambiguity so vital? Because if she married, she would either empower an English faction and create a dangerous rival, or she would marry a foreign prince and drag England into an expensive, disastrous foreign war. Her secret, the fact that she might marry, was a diplomatic tool. It was a carrot she dangled in front of every power in Europe. The moment she had actually married, the secret would have been gone and her power would have been diminished.
The secret of her single status survived because it was personally maintained by the Queen herself, using a combination of intense political savvy and a whole lot of dramatic procrastination. Her counselors, of course, were obsessed with the secret of her succession, who would rule after she died. This was the biggest, darkest secret in England, and it was a secret she took to her grave. The sheer volume of documents about possible marriages and succession plots is staggering. The archives are full of nervous letters from William Cecil, her chief minister, basically saying, "Your Majesty, please, just name a successor. We're all very anxious." And Elizabeth's response was always the same, a very elegant, very firm refusal to commit. The secret of who would follow Elizabeth was a secret preserved by a queen who understood that power is held in the unknown. She ensured that no one could plot successfully against her designated heir, because no one knew who that heir actually was. The secret survived the entire length of her reign because she was willing to let the entire nation hold its breath for 45 years, a rather exhausting dedication to mystery, clearly. Let's float over now to a much more morbid and equally secretive subject, the weird history of post-mortem secrets, the secrets that were revealed or hidden after a king or queen died. The body of a deceased monarch was often a source of tremendous anxiety. Was the death natural? Was it fast enough? Was there a chance of an heir? This is where the royal physician steps in. This poor man was not just a doctor, he was the custodian of the ultimate secret. Take the case of Henry IV of France. He was assassinated in 1610. The ultimate secret, of course, was who ordered the assassination, but a more immediate, less bloody secret lay in the preservation of his body. French kings were often embalmed, and their bodies were sometimes opened up, and various organs, the heart and the intestines, were removed and buried separately in different locations. The physician's job was to publicly declare the cause of death while quietly dealing with any inconvenient truths the autopsy might reveal. Did the king have a venereal disease? Was he riddled with tumors? These secrets had to be managed because they touched upon the dignity of the crown. A king could not be seen to have died ignobly or due to something considered a moral failing. The secret of the king's actual health survived the winter of his death by being physically buried in separate locations. The heart went here, the body went there.
It was a physical fragmentation of the truth, designed to ensure that no single person could hold all the pieces of the puzzle. The physician, armed with a carefully edited report, was the only one who held the full truth, and that truth was usually protected by the implicit threat of swift, unpleasant consequences. This custom of fragmented burial is a fascinating metaphor for historical secrecy. Disseminate the parts to protect the whole. The public gets the grand, official narrative of the king's glorious death, while the embarrassing biological secrets are literally dispersed across the landscape. Let's finish this part by drifting back to the Romanovs, to the very cozy yet utterly terrifying setting of the Tsarevich Alexei's fate under Peter the Great. This is the tragic and deeply secretive case of a father and son who fundamentally disliked each other, of course. Alexei, Peter's son and heir, was not interested in ships, forts, or forcing Russia to shave its beard. He was quiet, introspective, and generally preferred the company of priests to artillery officers. This made him, in Peter's eyes, a dangerous threat to his entire legacy. The final dark secret that survived this period was the Tsarevich's death. Alexei fled Russia to seek sanctuary in Vienna, but Peter, using a combination of threats and false promises, lured him back. Upon his return, Alexei was interrogated, denounced, and eventually died in prison. The official story was that he died of natural causes due to a sudden illness. This was the secret Peter insisted on preserving. The historical secret, however, is that Alexei was almost certainly tortured to death under questioning, probably on the direct orders or at least the direct negligence of his father. How did the real secret survive? It survived through hushed court diaries and diplomatic correspondence. Foreign ambassadors, who were highly trained gossips, observed the entire process. They recorded the official story, but then, in a highly coded section of their letters sent back to their home courts, they would detail the whispers, the sounds from the prison, the sudden arrival of the priests for last rites, the speed of the burial. These diplomatic pouches, traveling across frozen, war-torn Europe, were the ultimate secret carriers. The secret of Alexei's murder survived because it was too sensitive for Russian records, but too important for foreign powers to ignore. It was preserved by outsiders who were happy to record a truth that might one day be used against the ruling dynasty.
The absurd and secretive protocol of Versailles. That sounds perfect. Let's float now, very calmly, away from the icy grip of the Romanovs and gently settle down in the warm, glittering, but ultimately very fragile court of the French Bourbon dynasty at Versailles. If the Russian secret was preserved by cold and paranoia, the French secret was preserved by excessive etiquette and a crushing amount of silk. We're focusing on the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Of course he was the Sun King, because why not call yourself the center of the universe when you build the biggest, most expensive palace on the planet? Louis XIV's life was a performance, and the greatest secret he preserved was the sheer drudgery and personal awkwardness that lay underneath all the grandeur. Versailles was a massive golden filing cabinet of information, but the most important secrets were hidden in plain sight, disguised as protocol. Every action, from waking up to going to bed, was a public ceremony called the lever and the coucher. Think about the poor courtiers whose job it was to attend the king's lever, his official waking up. The king's personal, utterly private act of getting out of bed became a multi-stage, highly ritualized public performance attended by dozens of high-ranking nobles. The secret here was not what the king did in the morning, but how he controlled access to him. Who was allowed to hold his shirt? Who was allowed to watch him put on his left stocking? These small, seemingly absurd privileges were, in fact, the greatest secret of the court, the hierarchy of favor. The level of access you had to the king determined your power, your money, and your status.
The secret survived because it was expressed not in a document, but in a precise, almost sleep-inducing choreography of who stood where and who handed the king which item of clothing. If you stood one step closer to the king than your rival during the levee, that was a secret message to the entire court. I am more powerful than him. It was a secret preserved by inches and minutes, enforced by tradition and social terror. The great irony is that the most powerful man in Europe was often just a very tired man who desperately wanted to get dressed in private, but his personal comfort was sacrificed to maintain the great secret of absolute, undeniable authority. Let's move to a different kind of secret at Versailles, the secrets of love and lineage. The king, of course, had many mistresses, and the fact that he had mistresses was not a secret. It was an open secret, a feature of the court, particularly when the mistresses, like Madame de Montespan, became incredibly powerful political figures. The real secret was the legitimization of the royal bastards. Louis XIV had numerous illegitimate children whom he later legitimized and gave titles, making them minor princes and princesses. This was a hugely controversial act because it muddied the waters of the royal succession. The secret was preserved through meticulous private documentation and a highly controlled court narrative. The king and his mistress had to keep the birth itself a secret, often taking the child away immediately to be raised elsewhere. Then, years later, the king would suddenly announce the child's existence and their legitimization. This secret survived the winter because it was temporarily outsourced. The infant was hidden away with foster families or trusted nobles until they were old enough for the king to safely introduce them without creating immediate scandal. The court played a long, slow game of where did that child come from. The quiet, boring record of the child's identity was the key to the secret. A few scrawled private notes by a loyal official kept locked away were more important than all the cannons and armies in France. The secret was preserved by time and distance until it could be weaponized for political gain. Let's float over to a very different kind of court, one built not on silk and mirrors, but on ice and sudden death. The secrets of the early Ottoman Empire's harem. The imperial harem was a massive, self-contained world within the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, later Istanbul. It was home to hundreds of women, the sultan's mother, his wives, his concubines, and their massive retinue of eunuchs and servants, and the whole place was an absolute black hole for information. The greatest secret that survived here was the identity of the next sultan's mother. Within the harem, power was constantly shifting based on who could get their son to the throne first. The Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, was often the most powerful person in the empire, but only if her son survived and won the succession battle. The secret of who the sultan favored, which concubine was pregnant, which son was cleverest, was preserved by a combination of the physical architecture and the eunuch network. The harem was built like a maze with locked doors, private courtyards, and highly controlled passages. This structure literally preserved secrets by making physical observation impossible. If you didn't have access to the right courtyard, you simply didn't know what was happening. More importantly, the secrets were managed by the chief black eunuch, the Kislar Asi, who was often a figure of immense quiet power. He oversaw all communication into and out of the harem. Any secret, a letter, a message, a small vial of poison, had to pass through his network. The secret survived the winter of court intrigue by being encoded and physically carried by the most trusted yet powerless people. A message might be hidden in a piece of fruit or whispered in a coded language only known to two people. The eunuchs, who were outside the normal political and familial structures, were the ultimate keepers of these secrets. They had no dynastic ambitions, only loyalty to the person who gave them the most power. The secret survived because the carrier had nothing to gain by revealing it, until, of course, they did. Think about the psychological burden. A concubine has to conceal a pregnancy or a plot within a crowded, highly surveilled environment. The secret survived because of extreme self-control and the knowledge that one misplaced whisper could lead to a sudden, very sleepy end. Let's drift back to Europe for one last, highly dysfunctional example of secrecy preserved by collective delusion. We're looking at the strange, sickly world of the later Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was famously not holy, not Roman, and not really an empire, as Voltaire pointed out. It was a collection of hundreds of small, often ridiculous principalities, kingdoms, and bishoprics, all vaguely tied together by a figurehead emperor. The great secret that survived for centuries was the pretense of unity. Everyone knew the empire was a bureaucratic mess, constantly fighting itself and totally unable to mount any coordinated military action. But the secret that was fiercely guarded was the legal fiction that it was still a major cohesive power. This secret was preserved through endless legalistic wrangling and boring, detailed treaties. When two small German princes went to war over, say, the ownership of a particularly fertile field of rutabagas, the imperial diet would convene. This assembly would spend months, sometimes years, drafting a document that carefully, pedantically avoided mentioning the core problem while confirming the titles and dignities of both arguing parties. The secret of the empire's weakness survived because everyone involved was too invested in the pomp and circumstance of the system to admit it was broken. It was a secret kept alive by a mountain of paperwork, documents full of flowery language about imperial majesty and eternal peace that completely masked the reality of petty local squabbles. The secret was kept alive because the political alternative, admitting that the empire was useless, was too terrifying and too exhausting to contemplate. That gives us a nice calm place to pause. We've drifted from the rigid protocol of Louis XIV to the dark, intricate web of the Ottoman harem and the legalistic apathy of the Holy Roman Empire. The common thread, of course, is that the secrets that survived the winter were those that were physically isolated, weaponized for political gain, or simply ignored through collective agreement.
The coded secrets of the Serene Republic. Perfect. Let's make a very smooth, quiet transition now, leaving the massive, cold palaces of the Bourbons and the Romanovs, and floating south to the small, impossibly beautiful, but utterly paranoid city of Venice, the Serene Republic. This is a place where secrets were not just a necessary evil, they were the entire foundation of the state. Venice, sitting right there on the water, was the ultimate trading hub between East and West. Everyone came here: merchants, ambassadors, spies, assassins, and of course a huge number of people just looking to spend ridiculous amounts of money. For Venice to survive, caught between the power of the Ottoman Empire and the ambitions of the various European kingdoms, it had to know everything about everyone else and let no one know anything about itself. The key to this system was the Council of Ten, a supreme judicial and executive body, and beneath them, the state inquisitors. Now, the name inquisitors sounds dramatic, but their job was actually intensely bureaucratic and focused entirely on the preservation of secrets. The greatest secret of the Venetian Republic was the efficiency and reach of its intelligence network. It wasn't built on armies, it was built on informants, encryption, and a massive amount of meticulous, boring paperwork. The secrets that survived the brutal Venetian humidity, which in its own way is worse than the Russian winter, were preserved in coded dispatches sent back by Venetian ambassadors, baili, stationed all over Europe and the Near East. These baili were not just ceremonial figures, they were professional information gatherers.
Imagine an ambassador in the Ottoman court writing a dispatch. It couldn't just say, "The Sultan is planning to attack Cyprus." That was too direct. The secret survived because it was layered in dense, almost impenetrable code. Venetian codes were legendary. They were often based on complex substitution systems, where the key was constantly changed, or they used a nomenclator, a long list of pre-agreed coded words for common names, cities, and concepts. The secret was preserved by making the journey of decryption almost impossibly tedious. A clerk in the Doge's palace in Venice would have to spend days hunched over a candle, slowly translating line after line of numbers into political intelligence. This system didn't stop a secret from being stolen, but it ensured that by the time a thief deciphered it, the information was probably already too old to be useful. The secret was protected by the sheer bureaucratic difficulty of accessing it. A very sleepy, very effective method of keeping things safe. Let's look at another fundamental Venetian secret, the ballot box. The whole republic was run by a complex, interlocking system of councils and committees, all of whom were elected. This, in theory, was the most transparent part of their government. But the secret that survived was the rigged anonymity of the voting process. They used complex systems of selection, nomination, and multiple secret ballots, often involving gold and silver balls being drawn from urns. The goal was to ensure that while the result was known, the individual choice of the patrician who cast the vote remained an absolute secret. Why was this so vital? Because in a small city where every noble family knew every other noble family, the moment you knew who voted against whom, the whole system would dissolve into bloody vendettas. The secret was preserved by a fanatical dedication to the integrity of the ballot box. The secret survived the winter of political infighting because the system was designed to protect the individual from the consequences of their vote. This is an ironic contrast. A republic built on open trade and public display was at its heart completely dependent on the absolute secrecy of its decision-making. Let's gently float over to another, much older civilization that also relied on codified secrets, the world of Byzantine court espionage centered in Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, which lasted for 1,000 years, was a master of political manipulation, and their secrets were preserved not just by code, but by religious symbolism and manufactured awe. The great secret that survived the centuries in Byzantium was the fragility of the emperor's power. Every emperor knew that at any moment he could be overthrown by a rival general, a disgruntled relative, or a fanatical crowd in the hippodrome. They were constantly fighting to maintain a sense of divine, unassailable majesty. This secret was preserved through an elaborate, mind-numbing court protocol known as porphyringiture. The emperor's children were often born in a special chamber lined with purple marble, porphyra. This was a secret way of saying, "This child is born in the purple, chosen by God." The ritual was a secret language that elevated the emperor above mere human political squabbles. The secrets of the court, the plots, the poisonings, the blinding of rivals, were kept by a massive network of spies, but also by the simple fact that anyone who entered the imperial presence had to prostrate themselves completely, known as proskynesis. You couldn't plot against someone whose feet you were kissing. The secret survived the long winter of imperial decline because the Byzantines excelled at projecting an image of power and stability that was entirely divorced from the reality. The real secrets of financial ruin, military weakness, and constant internal fighting were masked by endless shimmering mosaics and hours of droning, complicated religious ceremonies. The secret was preserved by dazzling the observer until they were too tired and too overwhelmed to notice the obvious cracks.
Finally, let's wrap up this segment with a look at the secret life of medieval guilds. This is a great sleepy topic because it's less about kings and more about the quiet local secrets of craftsmen. In the medieval city, if you were a leather worker, a baker, or a stonemason, you belonged to a powerful guild. The greatest secret these guilds protected was the secret of the craft itself. How do you mix the pigments to get that specific shade of blue? How do you temper the steel to make the best sword? How do you build a Gothic arch that won't fall down? This knowledge was not written down in easy-to-read manuals. It was the guild's absolute core asset. The secret survived the winter because it was transmitted only through oral tradition and apprenticeship. A master craftsman would spend 7 to 10 years with an apprentice, slowly, painfully passing on the tiny tricks and details that made the craft work. The secret wasn't a piece of high politics, it was a simple, practical formula or technique. This knowledge was highly guarded. If you tried to set up a shop selling high-quality leather goods without being a member of the guild, they would use every trick, legal or otherwise, to shut you down. The secret survived the cold by being kept locked away in the hands of a few sworn, highly protective members. The ironic twist is that these trade secrets, once they were finally leaked or surpassed by new technology, were often the very basis for the next great industrial leap. The secret of the craft, protected for centuries, was the very engine of historical change.
The perfumed secrets of the salon and the scribbled truths of the Enlightenment. Excellent. Let's make one more long, gentle transition, moving out of the medieval and early modern palaces and into the slightly more refined, yet still deeply secretive, world of the 18th century European Enlightenment. This is a time when the greatest secrets were not hidden in battle plans or royal vaults, but were whispered behind fans in Parisian salons and scribbled in notebooks hidden from the censor. We are drifting into a world where absolute monarchies were starting to wobble, and ideas, radical, dangerous ideas, became the most precious and fragile secrets of all. We begin in Paris, the center of this intellectual ferment. The primary venue for the transmission of these dangerous ideas was the salon. These were regular, private gatherings hosted by wealthy, often very clever women. Think of them as the original, very exclusive social media, but with much better furniture and much more expensive coffee. The secret that survived the winter here was the open discussion of treason. In the salons, philosophers like Diderot and Rousseau, along with their wealthy patrons, could openly criticize the king, the church, and the entire structure of French society. They were talking about revolution, republicanism, and atheism, all things that could land a person in the Bastille. The secret survived because it was preserved by social convention and exclusivity. The salon was a private space. The police of the king, the lieutenant general de police, knew these salons existed. Of course they did. But to send an agent into a salon hosted by an extremely well-connected duchess would be a massive breach of etiquette and risk turning a quiet gathering into a political confrontation. The monarchy was often too concerned with maintaining the appearance of polite society to crack down on the reality of polite treason. The secret was preserved by a perfumed layer of plausible deniability. The guests were always very careful with their language, lots of ironic contrasts and philosophical abstractions, which made it difficult to prove concrete sedition. The secret survived because it was spoken in a highly educated, lightly sarcastic, and deliberately vague dialect. The secret was essentially protected by being too intellectual for the authorities to easily grasp. This brings us to the secrets of the Enlightenment philosophers themselves and how they managed to circulate their utterly subversive texts in a highly censored environment. We're talking about books like Diderot's Encyclopedia and Voltaire's endless stream of satirical pamphlets. The greatest secret here was authorship and publishing. If you wrote a book criticizing the church, you couldn't exactly march down to the royal printer and ask them to run off 5,000 copies. That would be a very short journey to prison. The secret survived by being printed abroad and smuggled in. Philosophers would send their manuscripts, the physical secrets written in their own hand, across the border to be printed in more liberal places like the Netherlands or Switzerland. The manuscript itself was a tremendous liability. Imagine a courier traveling from Paris to Amsterdam with a copy of a major anti-clerical text hidden inside a bale of ordinary Dutch cheese or sewn into the lining of a perfectly respectable waistcoat. The secret of the radical text survived the long, cold journey by being physically masked by the most mundane and uninteresting cargo possible. The knowledge of who printed the book, who smuggled it, and who sold it was a multi-layered secret maintained by a large network of incredibly nervous people. The secret of the dangerous idea survived the winter because it was physically carried by a chain of people who were paid just enough to risk being caught and who knew just enough to keep the supply chain moving, but not enough to betray the whole network if they were arrested. The whole thing was one huge, organized, and very sleepy criminal enterprise dedicated to spreading uncomfortable truths. Let's float over to a slightly darker example of secrecy in this era, the secrets of the 18th century postal systems. As monarchies centralized, they realized that the regular flow of letters, the most common way people communicated, was an untapped resource for intelligence. This is where the practice of cabinet noir, or the black chamber, comes in. The Black Chamber was a highly secret office established within the regular National Postal Service. Its entire purpose was to intercept, open, read, copy, and reseal private letters without anyone knowing. It was state-sponsored mail theft, essentially. The secret that survived here was the private life of the elite. If you were a diplomat, a general, or a noble, you assumed your letters were secret. But the Black Chamber was preserving a detailed archive of your most private thoughts, your financial troubles, your love affairs, and your actual political opinions, the ones you weren't sharing in the salon. The secret of the government's surveillance survived by being executed with absolute painstaking attention to detail. The operatives in the Black Chamber became masters of replicating seals, using special steam methods to unglue envelopes, reading the content, and then sealing them back up so perfectly that the recipient would never suspect. The secrets of hundreds of thousands of people's private lives were preserved in the archives of the state, not because they were great conspiracies, but because they were potential conspiracies. The secret survived because the postal workers and the spies had an insane bureaucratic dedication to invisibility. The government was keeping the ultimate secret, that there were no private secrets at all. Finally, let's move to a completely different kind of secret in the 18th century, the secrets of Freemasonry. Freemasonry exploded in popularity across Europe in the 18th century, attracting everyone from Enlightenment thinkers to kings and minor nobles. The entire organization was built on one fundamental, highly guarded secret, the rituals and the signs of recognition. Why were these rituals so important to keep secret? Because the ritual was the passport of trustworthiness. In an age of spies and state suspicion, knowing the specific handshake, the specific password, or the specific way to arrange the knives on the table was a secret code that said, "I am one of you, and I can be trusted with secrets." The secret survived the winter because it was transmitted purely through lived experience and oral instruction. The rituals were never written down in a comprehensive manual that could be seized by the police. They had to be performed, learned, and memorized within the secure, velvet-lined walls of the lodge. The ironic reality is that the actual secret of Freemasonry was deeply boring. It wasn't about plotting the overthrow of a government. It was about charity, self-improvement, and slightly tedious philosophical discussions about architecture.
But the perception of the secret, the idea that this powerful cross-border network knew something important, was infinitely more valuable than the reality. The secret was preserved by its own mysterious aura, making it too tempting and too pervasive for any single monarch to crush. It was a secret that survived the winter through its own effective branding.
Excellent. Let's make a final, slow descent into the secrets of the 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on a figure who sat at the absolute center of Europe's dynastic network, Queen Victoria. If the earlier secrets we discussed were about political maneuvering, the secrets of the Victorian age often became deeply personal, hidden in medical reports, and carried by genetics. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, had 9 children, and through their marriages she effectively connected all the major royal houses of Europe, from Russia to Spain. This sprawling, intensely intermarried family created a fantastic opportunity for secrets to survive the winter, specifically genetic secrets. The greatest and most famous secret that survived and spread throughout her family line was hemophilia. This is a genetic blood clotting disorder, and it was a royal secret that was literally, biologically passed down the generations through her daughters, who were carriers, to their sons in other royal houses. The irony here is that the family's meticulous focus on preserving bloodlines through strategic intermarriage, marrying cousins, of course they did, was the very thing that made the devastating secret so difficult to contain. They were trying to preserve their legitimacy through blood, but they were actually preserving a disease through the same blood. It's an incredibly potent, tragic contrast. Think about the poor royal physicians of the era. Their job was to manage this genetic time bomb. When a young prince in the Spanish or Russian court would suffer a sudden catastrophic bleed from a minor bump, the physician had to manage the secret. The official record would often just state a fall or a severe fever. The actual terrifying truth that the prince was afflicted with the dreaded English disease was confined to a very small circle of incredibly worried people. The secret of hemophilia survived the winter because it was medically masked and politically denied. To admit the existence of this disease was to admit that the royal line was flawed, perhaps even weak or cursed. The secret was preserved by a massive collective effort among Europe's royalty to pretend that their children simply had bad luck, not bad genes. It was a secret kept by medical euphemism. Let's glide over to another secret of Victoria's reign, the constant grinding tension over the mental health of some of her relatives and descendants. In the Victorian era, mental illness was viewed not just as a medical problem, but as a profound moral and dynastic shame. Take the secrets surrounding the family of Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. His father, Ernst I of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was widely known for his rather chaotic personal life, but the deeper secrets lay in the potential for mental instability. The secret that survived the winter was that when someone in the extended family suffered a serious mental breakdown, which, given the close intermarriage and the general stress of royal life, happened with depressing regularity, they were simply made to vanish. They weren't hospitalized in a public sense. They were moved to remote wings of castles or private estates and were gently, firmly erased from public life. The secret was preserved by physical isolation and biographical omission. Courtiers were instructed to never speak of the person again. The official records would suddenly cease mentioning them. The secret survived because it was literally placed in a geographic and social deep freeze, where the public and press couldn't access it. The tragedy, of course, is that these individuals were often condemned to decades of isolated, silent existence just to protect the purity of the family image. Now, let's briefly touch upon the dark, late-century secrets of the Tsar Nicholas II and the Romanovs, where the secrets of their small, intensely private family became the center of a national catastrophe.
The Romanovs had their own genetic secret, also courtesy of Queen Victoria. Their only son, Tsarevich Alexei, had hemophilia. This was the most catastrophic secret in Russian history. The secret of Alexei's illness was guarded with fanatical intensity. Nicholas and Alexandra knew that to reveal the heir's terminal condition would immediately destabilize the dynasty. The secret survived because it was known only to the parents and a few trusted servants, and tragically, to Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's power in the Russian court was a direct result of the secret. Because he seemed to have some success in calming Alexei's bleeding episodes, Alexandra became utterly dependent on him. This dependency, which led to Rasputin's influence over appointments and state policy, was the most destructive side effect of the core secret. The secret of Alexei's disease survived the winter because it was physically protected by the closed doors of the imperial nursery and politically weaponized by the one person who shouldn't have been trusted. The secret was so fragile and so crucial that its preservation ultimately destroyed the entire dynasty. It's an example of a secret that survived, but took down an empire with it. Finally, let's look at a much lighter but still intensely guarded secret of the Victorian era, the secrets of private identity and gender presentation. In the highly moralistic Victorian society, the slightest deviation from the norm was a secret that could destroy a career or a life. People who lived their lives in ways society frowned upon, whether it was homosexuality, an affair, or living outside of traditional gender roles, had to be absolute masters of secrecy. The secret survived by the creation of private, hidden spaces and coded language. They would use specific slang, meet in specific discrete clubs, and maintain dual identities. A highly respected gentleman in public might lead a completely different life after midnight. The secret was preserved by social performance. The best evidence for these surviving secrets comes not from official records, but from the slightest textual clues in personal diaries, coded phrases in letters, and the sudden, unexplained vacations of certain figures. The secret survived because it was too widespread and too personal to be centrally controlled, relying instead on a massive decentralized conspiracy of silence among friends and associates. It was a secret preserved by a shared understanding of what could not be said, but was absolutely quietly known.